Good morning, everyone. My name is Brad Potter, and I am a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Security Research at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. I'm happy to be joined today by my friend, Dr. Rachel Myrick, who will be discussing her recent book entitled Polarization and International Politics: How Extreme Partisanship Threatens Global Stability. Dr. Myrick is the Douglas and Ellen Lowery Associate Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Her research explores how partisan polarization affects foreign policymaking in democracies, with an emphasis on U.S. national security policy. Her first book, which we'll hear from her about today, was published in 2025 with Princeton University Press. Her research is published in many of the leading political science journals, including International Organization, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the Journal of Politics, among many others. Dr. Myrick completed her PhD in 2021 at the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, right here in the Bay Area. So it's good to welcome her back, if virtually, to the Bay. Now, just a few reminders before we begin our talk today. Dr. Myrick's lecture will be recorded and on the record, available at the CGSR website in the weeks ahead. The subsequent Q&A session will be off the record and follow the Chatham House rules style. Please feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand to ask them directly. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. And with that, Dr. Myrick, Rachel, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Just checking to make sure my screen's sharing correctly.
Looks good.
Thank you for having me, especially thanks to Brad for the invitation and for hosting. As Brad mentioned, I'm a political scientist at Duke and primarily interested in the domestic politics of international security, focusing both on how domestic politics impacts the foreign policymaking process and also on how politicians and the public interact on some of these key U.S. national security questions. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about a book I recently published. For the past several years, I've been working on a set of projects about the relationship between domestic political polarization and international relations. And the question this book asks, as implied by its title, is how does polarization affect the behavior of democracies in international politics? We know from existing literature that democracies enjoy many advantages in foreign affairs relative to non-democracies. But the main argument in this book is that polarization can weaken constraints on democratic leaders that are necessary to confer these advantages. As a result, polarization can make democratic foreign policy more volatile, and it can also make democracies less credible adversaries and less reliable allies. With application to the US, the main takeaway from this book is that we're fortunately not yet in a world where security issues are hopelessly polarized, but we're seeing some sets of issues increasingly pulled into the partisan divide, and it's important to take stock of that and think about the potential negative downstream consequences of what's happening. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about the background and the argument of the book at a high level, kind of give some of the big picture arguments. And then, because it's often hard to cover a full book in one talk, I'm just going to zoom into one chapter that asks questions about how polarization might affect the ability of the United States in particular to be a credible adversary. And then I'll try to conclude by briefly highlighting some connections to the current political moment, hopefully as a jumping off point for discussion. So we can talk about what is consistent or inconsistent with some of the patterns that we're observing today. So this book is motivated in part by recent concerns about polarization in advanced democracies. These concerns are not limited to the United States. They're affecting a wide range of countries, particularly in Europe and the Americas, but also in parts of South Asia and East Asia. And in fact, if you look at data on polarization in the US in comparative perspective, over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, the American experience is really not an outlier at all in terms of ideological polarization. A lot of measures place the US at middling levels of polarization relative to other OECD countries. But over the past decade, we've also seen a sharp increase in polarization in the US, particularly in terms of levels of societal polarization, or what's commonly known in political science as affective polarization. We also know, though, that, of course, polarization is not a new phenomenon. It's been a feature of democratic politics, both in the US and elsewhere, for a long time. Two quick examples. On the left is an electoral map from the 1880 US presidential election, reflecting the deep racial divisions between parties at the end of the Reconstruction era, a far more polarized time. On the right is a photograph of French socialist politician Léon Blum. In the 1930s, the French right wing adopted the slogan, "Better Hitler than Blum," with the implication being that foreign occupation might actually be preferable to socialist control of France. So in general, we think about policy disagreement, political contestation as good things, as healthy features of liberal democracies. But these types of scenarios I referred to are cases of what might be termed extreme polarization, which the book defines as being distinctive in 4 key ways. First, in environments of extreme polarization, ideological polarization, that is, increasing policy distance between parties or coalitions of parties, and affective polarization, that is, increasing social distance between parties, tend to reoccur and at times reinforce one another. Second, the stakes of winning are heightened, which gives incentives for politicians to kind of tilt the playing field to their advantage. This is associated with processes of democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. And third, ideologues or party activists have incentives to extend partisan conflict to new policy domains. So policies that might not be central to the partisan cleavage ex ante can rapidly become polarized, and this often happens in the context of electoral cycles. And lastly, and perhaps most relevant for this project, environments of extreme polarization are associated with the weakening of constraints on democratic leaders. It starts to become harder to hold leaders accountable for their policy decisions, which in turn has lots of downstream implications for foreign policy. This book is an academic book in political science. It's rooted in the domestic politics of international relations literature. A lot of scholarly work in this space really focuses on the causes and consequences of regime type for international relations. That is, how do democracies and non-democracies behave in foreign affairs, and how these different systems of government lead to different outcomes. A new generation of scholarship has emphasized that there's a lot of variation in the way that different authoritarian regimes conduct foreign policy, how single-party regimes, for instance, behave differently than personalist dictatorships. But this book emphasizes, of course, there's also a ton of variation in the conduct of foreign policy among democracies. And perhaps an underappreciated source of that variation is the degree of partisan polarization and the presence of extreme polarization in particular. In general, I'd say that in political science, we know a lot about the causes and consequences of polarization for domestic politics and society, but honestly, we know a lot less about how it might impact foreign affairs and international politics writ large. And this book is one of many, I think, recent works that is in that vein. The theory in this book starts with what's referred to as the democratic advantage tradition in international relations. This idea that democracies tend to have advantages relative to non-democracies. Of course, not everybody subscribes to this tradition of thought, but since the 90s, it's been one of the dominant traditions of thought in international relations. And the book identifies 3 advantages from this tradition that democracies are believed to have. The first is a stability advantage. Many scholars have pointed out that despite the fact that democracies have regular elections and regular leader turnover, they tend to actually keep foreign policy surprisingly consistent across time. And this is really attributable to 2 main things. For one, politicians recognize that good foreign policy making requires long time horizons. It requires commitments that extend beyond a leader's tenure in office. And so they reach what's commonly referred to as a tacit partisan truce on aspects of foreign affairs, especially in the national security space, to kind of consider some domains above the fray of partisan politics. In addition, recognizing the inevitability of leader turnover, leaders have incentives in democracies to try and invest in the creation and maintenance of nonpartisan foreign policy institutions that help to maintain continuity across different administrations. The second advantage is a credibility advantage. This is what I'll talk about a good deal in this talk, but in brief, the idea is that democracies are able to leverage domestic constraints in order to credibly signal information abroad to adversaries. They're simply better equipped to issue coercive threats. The third advantage is a reliability advantage, that democracies tend to be more cooperative. They tend to be better able to make and keep commitments to their allies. All three of these advantages are upheld by two systems of constraint on democratic leaders. Vertical constraints help keep leaders accountable to the public, often through regular elections. And horizontal constraints help keep leaders accountable to other actors in government, like a legislator or a legislature or a judiciary. And here I'll primarily be focusing on the role of the political opposition, either an opposition party or an opposition coalition, in constraining the leader. The theory then introduces polarization as an important source of variation among democracies and discusses how it interacts with these different constraints and in turn how that might affect each of these three democratic advantages. The overarching argument of the book is that extreme polarization weakens vertical and horizontal constraints on leaders, thereby undermining the democratic advantages. To demonstrate this, the book really does three things. In the first empirical chapter, it provides lots of descriptive statistics about different types of polarization across countries, develops some new measures of extreme polarization, and shows that they're broadly correlated with worse foreign policy outcomes. After establishing those descriptive patterns, the rest of the chapters dive into the case of contemporary US foreign policy, holding relatively constant in a particular institutional context and trying to think about the ways in which polarization might undermine stability, credibility, and reliability in the United States. Each of these chapters follows a pretty similar structure. First, by identifying how growing polarization interacts with vertical constraints or accountability to the public, using a combination of existing public opinion data and original public opinion surveys. And then it explains how this feeds into the incentives of politicians and erodes horizontal constraints, drawing on data about the behavior of the political opposition over time. And finally, each chapter talks about the implications for the democratic advantages, illustrating this with a case. And then in the last chapter, I spend some time talking about how polarization in foreign policy might be mitigated, when it actually might be a good thing, and how to think about extending this framework to non-US cases. As I mentioned today, I'll just zoom into one chapter, which asks how might growing polarization affect the ability of the US to be a credible adversary? And this is just to give you kind of a flavor of the types of arguments and evidence that the book draws on. In international relations, the term credibility is kind of a loaded term with a lot of different definitions. Here specifically, I'm talking about democracies being able to credibly signal information when they bargain with foreign adversaries. There are lots of different implications of the credibility advantage for international politics, but this chapter really focuses on two. First, democracies are able to leverage agreement between domestic actors to signal their resolve in international crises. Signaling resolve or willingness to fight is, of course, important because it makes democracies more effective at issuing threats and deterring potential challengers. So, how do democratic leaders leverage these domestic groups? Well, in practice, when the public or the political opposition supports the executive, this presents a unified front to adversaries, and that's what generates a credible signal of resolve. So in the US, for instance, when Democrats and Republicans actually agree on something, that's an especially credible signal. A second implication of the credibility advantage is that democracies are also able to leverage moderate forms of disagreement between domestic actors to extract concessions from adversaries in a negotiation. What I mean by that is a democratic leader can credibly go to their foreign counterpart and say, this is what's going on in domestic politics. I'm not going to be able to sell that deal to my public or to the opposition, so we're going to need to make a better deal. And so overall, this suggests counterintuitively that precisely because democratic leaders are more constrained domestically, they're more credible internationally. But these arguments are really predicated on an ideal liberal democracy that has functioning horizontal and vertical constraints. What I'm arguing in the book is that as polarization grows, the nature of these constraints start to change. First, thinking about the role of vertical constraints or accountability to the public. In an ideal liberal democracy, the public generally trusts the foreign policy decision-making of their leaders, rewards them for enacting foreign policy that leads to good outcomes, and tends to punish them for enacting foreign policy that leads to bad outcomes. But as polarization becomes more extreme, a partisan public grows increasingly likely to distrust the decision-making of a leader from the opposite party, and they're in fact more likely to reward co-partisan politicians for obstructing that leader in foreign affairs. Second, thinking about the role of horizontal constraints or accountability to the political opposition, in an ideal liberal democracy, politicians tend to set aside partisan differences and kind of rally behind leaders during times of crisis. But they demonstrate, opposition when there's actually principled disagreement over policy. As polarization grows more extreme, politicians are going to be more likely to just obstruct leaders from the opposite party, and they're going to be less likely to simply rally behind those leaders during times of crisis. These constraints, in turn, shape the credibility advantage. As polarization grows, it's going to be more difficult for democratic leaders to leverage domestic constraints to send credible signals in international politics. What this chapter does is use multiple strategies to try and illustrate how this logic might play out in contemporary US foreign policy. First, to look at the relationship between polarization and horizontal constraints. It uses data from first to look at the relationship between polarization and vertical constraints. It uses some public opinion surveys to look at how partisanship shapes how the public evaluates presidential decision-making in crises and negotiations. And then to look at the relationship between polarization and horizontal constraints, it uses data from congressional roll call votes and congressional speeches. And then finally, it considers how polarization might affect negotiations with foreign adversaries by drawing on a particular case. And the case I'll talk about a little bit today is thinking about how polarized politics impacted the negotiation of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal. So I'll pause here for a moment to allow you to admire the theoretical framework while I take a quick water break. Okay, so now I will begin with the survey experiment in this chapter. If you're unfamiliar with survey experiments, the logic is just to embed a benign behavioral manipulation in a public opinion survey in order to better understand the relationship between two variables. So this survey was fielded in August of 2024, directly before the 2024 US presidential election, to a sample of over 4,000 adults in the US. The purpose of the survey is to kind of show how the average American's partisan identity biases their evaluation of how a president responds to a foreign adversary. In the survey, I started by collecting demographic information about respondents, including about their party and how they voted in prior elections. And then there was a basic experimental manipulation where respondents were randomly assigned to read about one of two hypothetical scenarios. Half of respondents read a scenario in which either Democratic candidate Kamala Harris won the 2024 election, and half of them read a scenario in which Republican candidate Donald Trump won. They received an image of the candidate on the campaign trail, and then they reflected in a paragraph about what they expected that president to do in foreign policy if they were elected. Then they read about that same candidate responding to two sets of scenarios in the future as a president that involved a foreign adversary. The first scenario that they read about was an international crisis. They read either about a hypothetical Russian invasion of Estonia or about a hypothetical Chinese invasion of Taiwan. The second scenario was an international negotiation with an adversary, either negotiating a new nuclear agreement with Iran or restarting talks about North Korea's nuclear program. The idea here is to draw on a wide range of salient news topics that are relevant for everyday Americans and to present a variety of different types of adversaries that have varying degrees of hostility towards the US. For both of these scenarios, respondents were asked three outcome questions. They were asked to evaluate presidential judgment and decision-making in these scenarios. Then they were told how the president responded to the scenario and asked to evaluate the president's policy. The policy was the same regardless of which candidate they read about. And finally, they were asked about how the congressional opposition, that is, the opposite party in Congress, should respond to the president's policy, and in particular, if they should try to obstruct the president. For the sake of time, I'm just going to show you the results from the crisis scenarios, but the results from the negotiation scenarios actually look quite similar, but are even more partisan. The first question is whether the president would show good judgment in responding to the crisis. And for all of these plots that I'll show you, the y-axis is just a probability. Here, the proportion of respondents who say it's likely or very likely that the president would show good judgment. Democratic respondents are in blue and Republican respondents are in red. People who read about a president from the opposite party are on the left, and those who read about a president from the same party are on the right. Here, what we have is very similar results for both sets of crises and for both Republicans and Democrats, which is that people overwhelmingly think their in-party president would show good judgment in responding to a crisis, and their out-party president would not. These results look pretty symmetric across Republicans and Democrats. Of course, not surprising to see a partisan bias here, but the extent of it is always quite striking. A harder test of partisan bias would be to give participants in the survey an actual policy response and see if they react differently to the president from a different party giving the exact same response. So in the crisis scenarios, I tell respondents that the president, either Trump or Harris, is going to respond by sending in US military troops to defend Estonia from Russia or Taiwan from China, and ask whether or not they disapprove of the response. Here again, what we see is a partisan bias across all conditions. Respondents are much more likely to approve of the same policy response when it's enacted by a president from their party. But the partisan bias isn't quite as strong relative to abstract evaluations of the president's judgment. The last set of questions asks about how the congressional opposition, that is, congressional Democrats in the Trump case or congressional Republicans in the Harris case, should respond to the president's policy. And specifically, respondents are asked whether the opposition should express approval or disapproval, and whether or not they should take additional actions to try and support or prevent the president from enacting their policies. Here, I measure obstruction as respondents who think that the politicians from the other party should express disapproval, but also try to take additional actions to stop the president from enacting their policies. Across all scenarios, we see that respondents are more likely to approve of obstructing an out-party president, but the majority don't advocate for obstruction flat out overall. These effects are also much stronger throughout the survey for strong partisans who are much more likely to endorse obstruction. So stepping back, kind of what does this snapshot tell us? What the survey found is that partisans are more likely to distrust an out-party president and more likely to approve of an obstructing that president, and that this effect is stronger among strong partisans. So quite intuitively, we could think about how, as polarization becomes more extreme and the public becomes more partisan, This is increasingly weakening vertical constraints on leaders. There's growing distrust of the decision-making of the opposite party, and it's harder to hold presidents accountable for enacting policy that leads to bad outcomes. I think these results indicate that the US certainly isn't there yet, right? The partisan bias is not overwhelming yet, but the trend or pattern, if polarization continues to increase, is troubling. The next thing that this chapter does is to try and think about how these incentives might shape the behavior of politicians and what the implications could be for the credibility advantage. So to do that, I look at how the behavior of the political opposition has changed over time as polarization has increased, using a lot of data on roll call voting in Congress and on congressional speeches. I won't walk through all the methods and technical details here, but I'll just point out two key patterns. The first pattern is that if you look at congressional roll call votes on foreign affairs, they basically show that the opposing party in Congress has increasingly cohered against the president over time. And here I'll just show you a quick visual example of what I mean without going into the math. Here I'm mapping politicians in two-dimensional space based on their roll call votes in foreign affairs and defense policy. So points that are further away from each other vote more dissimilarly. This is a snapshot of the 95th and 96th Congresses during the Carter administration, and Jimmy Carter is represented here in blue, and all of the congressional Republicans are mapped here in red and labeled with their state abbreviation. We, of course, canonically think about Carter as a dove, so unsurprisingly, he's quite distant in two-dimensional space from the median Republican legislator, who is represented by a black dot. But what's really interesting over time is that the opposition has become much more coherent in terms of their voting. So, for instance, fast forward to the Obama administration, and in fact, we see Obama looks pretty similar in this policy space relative to Carter. And there's a somewhat similar distance between Obama and the median Republican, but congressional Republicans are a lot more coherent in voting against the president on foreign affairs and defense policy specifically. And this illustrates a general trend across foreign affairs roll call votes. The trend looks similar across both Republican and Democratic presidents, with the major shifts really occurring in the 21st century. But in this chapter, what I'm interested in is not just how legislators are voting in foreign affairs, but specifically how they're responding to crises that involve foreign adversaries. So another thing that this book does is to use the congressional record, which contains all the speeches in Congress, to identify speeches about international crises and that the United States has been historically involved in, and then to use machine learning methods to measure how polarized congressional speech is in response to those crises. Again, without boring you with the technical details, if you do this exercise, there's one main takeaway, which is that over time, you see that congressional responses to international crises have become more partisan. And interestingly, this trend actually maps pretty closely onto what we know about patterns of domestic polarization writ large. That polarization starts increasing in the late 1970s and increasing at a faster rate through the 90s. And we are observing kind of similar dynamics happening in terms of the partisanship in response to foreign crises. Overall, the broader takeaway from this section is that as polarization becomes more extreme, we're seeing politicians become more coherent and more partisan in their roll call voting in foreign affairs. And we're also seeing responses to crises become more partisan. This could erode the credibility advantage by making it harder to signal resolve and making it more challenging to kind of locate and present that unified bipartisan front to a foreign adversary. But earlier I mentioned that another interesting implication of the credibility advantage is that Democratic leaders can actually leverage disagreement between domestic actors to extract concessions in an international negotiation. This is the idea of like negotiation 101, where you can go to your foreign counterpart and say, hey, my guys back home aren't going to accept this deal. We really need a more favorable deal. This type of strategy is effective at moderate levels of polarization, where there's some chance that the opposition is ultimately going to get on board with some type of agreement. But as polarization grows, a few interesting things start to happen. For one, there are more incentives for the opposition to obstruct or derail negotiations. In addition, anticipating that obstruction, a leader could be just deterred from starting a complex negotiation in the first place. Moreover, and I would argue that we see a lot of instances of this dynamic now, leaders might increasingly seek to box out opposition from the negotiation process, just sort of saying to their foreign counterparts, hey, just ignore those Democrats or those Republicans in Congress. And the effect of that is that you lose the leverage that otherwise comes from more moderate forms of disagreement. So to illustrate this dynamic around a negotiation process, the book talks through a case of US-Iranian relations and the negotiation of the 2015 JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal. For this section of the book, I conducted interviews in DC and was specifically interested in how changing politicization around US-Iranian relations impacted the perspective of the US negotiators and how the Obama White House interacted with the Hill on this issue, as well as how they interacted with their Iranian counterparts. I think this case is interesting because in part, this bilateral relationship became increasingly politicized, in large part due to changes in domestic politics in the context of the Republican presidential primary in advance of the 2016 US election. So here, for example, a quote from a senior White House official working in legislative affairs. Originally, we thought for sure we would get Republican support for the deal, support from Senator Bob Corker and co., but this happened to be an electoral cycle where many aspiring Republican presidential candidates were on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so it made sense to be hawkish on Iran. During the Republican primary, the first person would say, I'm going to rip up the Iran deal, and the second would say, I'm going to rip up the Iran deal on the first day in office, and the third would say, I'm going to burn it first and then rip it up. A variety of actions taken by congressional Republicans contributed to this environment of mutual mistrust between the Obama White House and the Hill. You may recall, for instance, Republican Speaker of the House John Boehner inviting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Congress to deliver a speech in March of 2015, as well as Senator Tom Cotton and 46 other Republicans signing an open letter to Iranian leaders saying really any agreement that they made with the Obama administration would likely be invalid. So as a result, the Obama administration also came to view all congressional Republicans as pure spoilers, right? In these polarized contexts, it starts to get really hard to differentiate between things that are sincere policy disagreement and things that are kind of partisan antics. And so rather than saying to Iranian counterparts, Congress isn't going to accept X or Y, so we need to make a better deal, the approach that the administration was forced to take was basically to say, hey, just ignore the craziness in our domestic politics. The net effect of this was to really box Congress out of this delicate negotiation process, and that was perceived even by Democratic members of Congress. So here is a quote from a Democratic senior staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who said, we were trying to understand the parameters of what the Obama administration was actually negotiating. To be honest, I found it quite difficult. Despite having personal contacts at state, there was a lockdown in terms of the detail of what they were doing, and that was just because there was so much mistrust. This dynamic suggests that as polarization becomes more extreme, there are incentives for the opposition to increasingly obstruct a leader, and anticipating that obstruction, leaders box out the opposition, and then it becomes harder to leverage moderate domestic dissent in a way that could be productive to a negotiation. And of course, we know without buy-in from Republicans, the Iran deal ultimately was concluded without substantial bipartisan support. It was a less durable agreement, and the subsequent administration withdrew from the deal. The overarching takeaway from this chapter is that as polarization becomes more extreme, it can weaken vertical and horizontal constraints on leaders. And it becomes harder for leaders to effectively leverage domestic constraints to credibly signal information to adversaries. So while today you just saw one chapter, stepping back, I want to highlight what I think are three contributions of the book overall. The first is that this book offers a corrective to the democratic advantage tradition in international relations by pointing out that there are common features of democracies that themselves can undermine these advantages. And the chief one is, of course, the presence of extreme polarization. In highlighting this book makes a second contribution, which is to link research on the effects of polarization on democratic institutions and on political behavior to theories of international relations. We know a lot about how polarization impacts domestic politics, but a lot less about how it impacts international politics. And finally, this book does a lot to characterize the trajectory of polarization in US foreign policy specifically. It goes in depth about how to think about what's happening in the US in comparative contexts, which foreign policy issues might be more prone to politicization, and why. And I want to highlight that a recurring theme throughout the book is that the situation actually is not especially dire in US foreign policy right now, but there are lots of early warning signs that are concerning about trends in polarization and foreign policy more generally. And we need better conceptual frameworks to be able to identify and respond to that. In the last few minutes here, I just want to talk quite briefly about how the book might intersect with this current political moment, because many of the elements of this book are kind of theoretical or technical, and it's helpful to ground some of the more fundamental dynamics in what's happening in the current administration right now. And I would caveat that this book really is not meant to be a book about the Trump era. The arguments themselves are not tied to the current moment. So I think there are things that do and don't stand. So one of the arguments that this book makes is that foreign policy right now is less polarized than domestic policy, but that we're seeing and should expect to continue to see polarization on certain foreign policy issues. And the book identifies a few key issue areas where we see clear trends in public opinion diverging along party lines, and therefore where we should expect more volatility with leader turnover. So 3 of those domains the book emphasizes. The first are foreign policy issues that easily link to social identity. In the US, we know partisan identity is increasingly a social identity. It's correlated with all sorts of other social identities like gender, race, religion, and region. And because aspects of those identities become politicized, areas of foreign policy that are linked to them are also more likely to be polarized. So I think one of the key areas of emphasis we're seeing right now is immigration and refugee policy, which is linked to ethnic and racial identity as well as regional identity. And this is an area where we've seen a lot of volatility and change across the Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump administrations, including most recently around changes to refugee resettlement programs and ending of temporary protective status. The second set of foreign policy issues that are particularly prone to politicization are issues that involve non-traditional security threats that can't be easily resolved with military means. We've seen kind of this push and pull between the 2 parties, whereby the Democratic Party has been traditionally seeking to kind of broaden the concept of national security, and that to a certain extent has arguably backfired among Republican voters. Examples of non-traditional security threats include things like global health security, climate security, border security, and we've seen Trump and this administration walking back a lot of Biden era policies. The final set of issues that I think are particularly prone to partisan conflict are debates that involve multilateralism and internationalism, which are in many ways kind of foundational questions about the role the United States should play in the world. Polling shows among Republican voters that there has been a consistent undercurrent of skepticism about multilateralism and global governance. And some of the debates that, some of these debates are many decades, if not close to a century old. And Trump's America First foreign policy agenda is just a recent manifestation of some of this skepticism. There are lots of examples of policy changes from this past year or 2 of the second Trump administration, most notably rethinking around existing U.S. security commitments and dismantling of U.S. foreign aid programs. Another theme of the book is that the stability of foreign policy across administrations is not just a function of policy preferences, but it also is really connected to the politicization of national security institutions that serve as another constraint on presidential power. So one of the chapters in the book walks through strategies of politicization that leaders use and points out that these are nothing new. There's been plenty of historical examples of this. But as polarization increases, it's likely that we'll see more incentives for the president to engage in these strategies, and we'll see more accusations from the opposite party that our foreign policy institutions are being politicized. So the main case in the second Trump administration that has been obviously a big focus has been these attempts to transform aspects of the federal bureaucracy. And depending on your political persuasion, that might be seen as reducing waste, or it might be seen as purging or hollowing out of federal agencies. And these are some interesting questions that lots of agencies and some national security institutions are grappling with. Another theme from the book is that as congressional politics becomes more polarized, presidents have more incentives to circumvent Congress. And we're going to see more examples of presidents unilaterally entering into or withdrawing from international commitments. The main way we see this today is the increasing propensity of presidents using executive agreements and non-binding political commitments rather than international treaties that require congressional ratification. And because those forms of commitment don't actually require ratification, they're typically not made with substantial bipartisan buy-in, and then they're subsequently much easier to overturn. Finally, at the extremes, we could in theory envision a US where different parties have fundamentally different relationships with allies and adversaries. And there are other democracies in the world where this is the case. I would emphasize again that I don't think that we're in this world or close to it, but early on in Trump's second term, there was certainly concern among European allies that they saw the president's relationship with Russian leadership as deeply concerning. I think this concern is also highlighted more generally by shifting prioritization of different regions of the world across presidential administrations. So for instance, last fall when the national security strategy was released, it articulated a new vision for prioritizing the Western Hemisphere. And whether or not this is fully realized, I think it's important to think about how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party articulating fundamentally different ideas about how the US should orient itself in foreign policy might complicate the ability of the US to maintain commitments or to be a credible adversary over time. Stepping back today, I hope I've just emphasized that polarization is an important and potentially underappreciated source of variation in democratic foreign policy making. This book aims to show that polarization could have big impacts on the stability, credibility, and reliability of democracies. And as more and more democracies grapple with polarization, we'll need to understand its relationship with international politics. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions. I also want to flag that I very much welcome comments talking about this subject. It's really interesting for me to personally hear how polarization has or potentially even has not impacted your work. And it's especially informative to hear about that from people who engage in the practice of national security on a daily basis. So thank you for your time.